From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
This is really almost a desperate plea for some of these philanthropists who know how to make a lot of money but don't have a clue as to what to do with it. Those are the exact words that were given to me by a major multi-billionaire in America, and he included himself in that. Okay, if that's true, you know how to make a lot of money, but you don't have a clue as to what to do with it, let's get together with the citizen groups, the citizen leaders who have put their lives in the pursuit of justice year after year in some sort of interpersonal exchange, face-to-face, getting by the screeners and the sentinels that keep these philanthropists from getting great ideas and giving them major roles in the history of our country and its future.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman, the man who makes Anthony Scaramucci look like Pope Francis.
A lot of people make fun of Anthony Scaramucci, but he's overcome a lot of obstacles in life, like going to Harvard Law School.
As we know, as did the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, Steve, David, Jimmy. I guess, David, that remark shows why you're called an amateur comedian. We have a great joke. we have a very great opportunity today to talk about giving, philanthropy, in substantial detail and how it affects all communities.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to explore the world of philanthropy and the proper role of private wealth in public life. And we're going to be doing that with the author and founder of the website Inside Philanthropy, David Callahan, who's also written a book about the subject called The Givers. We will also, as always, check in with corporate crime reporter Russell Mokhiber and get to more of your listener questions and who knows what else, where the day will take us. But first, let's talk about philanthropy and the role it plays in influencing public policy.
David Callahan is founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy. That's a website examining how foundations and major donors are giving away their money and why. Mr. Callahan has written extensively on trends in philanthropy, as well as American culture, public policy, and business. And he's also an author, most recently, of The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, David Callahan.
It's great to be here.
Thank you, David Callahan. Listeners should know there's probably nobody in the United States that knows more about big philanthropy. That's the kind that comes out of Silicon Valley, New York City, L.A., multi-billionaires giving to their favorite causes. Let's start with this question. To what extent did you get access to talk to people like the Walton family, the Koch brothers, the Buffetts, Eli Broad in Los Angeles? Did you have difficulty getting through them? And if you did, tell us about the nature of the interviews that form part of your book.
Yeah, it's a good question. Many of these billionaire types are highly guarded, right? A lot of people want their time. A lot of people want to interview them. They're wary of press coverage, which, can often be negative. And so some of them talked to me and some of them didn't. For example, Priscilla Chan, who is Mark Zuckerberg's wife and is helping give away that big Facebook fortune, she talked to me after kind of months of sort of trying to find the time in her schedule. These people are also really busy, so it can be hard to just get on the agenda. I was not able to talk to Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg, and so there could have been some more people I would have loved to have talked to for the book.
How about the Walton family or the Buffetts?
I talked to one of the Buffett kids, Howard, who is busy giving away a slice of his father's wealth. What most people don't know is that Warren Buffett is sending a lot of money to the family foundations run by his 3 children. But he's giving most of his money to the Gates Foundation. People know that, but his 3 children also have foundations, and they're now giving away hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in short order. But I found that it's extremely difficult to reach these philanthropists to give them ideas. Oftentimes their foundations have a clause on their website saying applications are not solicited for grants. And that surprises me because they are tax exempt, and it's not really the best thing to say to the public that all you don't have any ideas to give to us. We have our own ideas. And I think that's a more pronounced trend recently, isn't it? Can you comment on that?
Oh, yeah. A lot of these new foundations do not accept unsolicited proposals, and some of them don't even have websites, or they have very bare bones websites with no information for how to get in touch. I think partly that reflects the fact that these people don't want to be deluged with requests and also don't want to put in place the capacity to respond to them all, and so they just try to turn people away. But meanwhile, there's plenty of people who do get through offering that advice, right? Their fellow philanthropists have lots of ideas for how to give away their money, consultants, peers in their own industry. So one hopes that these people do get a range of ideas and suggestions that are good ones for how to dispose of some pretty large fortunes.
So you're saying if you know how to get through and you're persistent, you can surmount this barrier that's on their website. I understand they don't want to be deluged with thousands of single-page requests to help this and that. But give us an idea how big, in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars, are these big philanthropists right now?
Well, the big thing to understand about this new philanthropy is that it really reflects the grotesque economic inequality that has arisen in the United States over the past 3 decades. That the top 400 wealthiest Americans now have a net worth of around $2.5 trillion, which is the equivalent of the net worth of the bottom 61% of U.S. households. And that sort of aggregation of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder has really happened over the last 3 decades. Back in 1982, there were just 13 billionaires in America, and to get on the Forbes 400 list, you only needed $80 million. Flash forward to today, and there's more billionaires than will fit on that Forbes 400 list. You need 1.7 billion to just get on the list. And the richest person on is Bill Gates with around $90 billion. Jeff Bezos also right up there with him. And so there's just a phenomenal amount of money at the top. These people keep getting richer and richer too. I mean, the Koch brothers back in 2005, they were worth about $9 billion put together. Now they're worth about $90 billion.
Since when? 2000 what?
Since 2005.
They went from what to what?
From $9 billion to $90 billion. And, Michael Bloomberg famously, was elected as mayor of New York. He was a billionaire in 2001. He was worth about $4 billion in 2001. He's now worth about $48 billion. And a lot of these people at the very highest level, at that pinnacle of the income ladder, have seen just these massive gains in wealth. At the same time, of course, that many ordinary Americans have just been kind of swimming in place economically and haven't seen any real income gains at all.
Well, tell us about the Walton family. Let's start with Walmart, because they're a low-wage company, and Walton's family are the biggest shareholders by far of the Walmart company. So how do they justify their philanthropy on the one hand, and you can talk about that, with not using some of Walmart's profits to upgrade the desperate livelihoods of over 1 million workers?
Yeah, there's some real contradictions there. The Walmart's Foundation, which is the corporate foundation of the Walmart stores, separate from the Walton Family Foundation, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the Walmart Foundation, one of its big issues is hunger and giving money for anti-hunger efforts in America. But as it turns out, as many people know, there are tens of thousands of Walmart workers who are on food stamps because they're not being paid enough to meet their basic nutritional needs. And so obviously, yes, if the Walton family wanted to do something big, they could really help push up those wages for Walmart. There has been a little increase lately in those Walmart wages, but, many of those workers are still on food stamps. In terms of the Walton Family Foundation, this is the foundation of the family that has the descendants of Sam Walton. They have a collective net worth of about $150 billion. They're the wealthiest family in America. And that foundation has long focused on promoting charter schools. So one of the biggest funder of charter schools in America. It's given over $1 billion to build charter schools and to kind of power up the school choice movement in the U.S., and it plans to give $1 billion more in the next 5 years to accelerate its efforts to build charter schools. But the other big issue that it recently added was the environment. The third generation of Walton descendants, the grandchildren of Sam Walton, are apparently quite worried about the environment, and this has become one of the big issues of that family, in that family foundation. Walton Family Foundation is now one of the biggest, if not the biggest, funder of environmental work in the United States.
Well, our listeners will appreciate the irony here. There have been many reports that the low wages paid to Walmart workers are so low that Walmart specialists assist them in teaching them how to fill out forms to get food stamps, energy assistance, housing assistance, Medicaid, because they don't get paid enough for those essential needs in life. And so by the same token, the Walmart Foundation is giving money to combat hunger. This is one of the reasons why in your book, which was widely and favorably reviewed, although I thought some of the reviews really didn't understand your book, they were more bemused by the figures and the celebrity names. You're worried about the abuse of power here. For example, as you said, the Walton family money goes to building and pushing charter schools, which means it's a real big player in the whole controversy of public schools and education in America. And the Koch brothers, of course, they have their own foundation. They're into all kinds of controversial political issues. The Gates Foundation, which has, I guess, over $50 billion or so now, is shaping not just public health in developing countries abroad, more vaccines, more health services, but also education. They supported the small high school project, for example, and Zuckerberg in Newark with $100 million, the Facebook founder. That didn't turn out too well. Give our listeners some sense of your concern here about what you think is not only excessive power, but it's concentrated in fewer and fewer gigantic foundations.
Yeah, well, the big picture here is that rising economic inequality of the past few decades has been translating into political and civic inequality, which makes a lot of sense. Wealthy people with significant resources will find ways to use those resources to get their way in public life and to promote the views they care about. And philanthropy is one tool to do that. There are others, of course, like giving money to politicians or for elections or putting money into lobbying. But philanthropy is certainly becoming one of these tools by which the wealthy wield power. And, you see it on both the left and the right. The Koch brothers, famously helped bankroll a whole network of conservative libertarian policy groups over the past 40 years with a tremendous amount of influence, places like Cato Institute. On the left, you have people like George Soros, who've played an instrumental role in kind of building up a new progressive policy infrastructure over the past 15 years or so. So one thing my book does is it doesn't really pick sides in terms of sort of pointing out who are the real bad guys here, as much as it says, hey, all of this giving by this kind of politicized philanthropy really is amplifying the voice of that top, not 1%, the top 0.01% at a time when we're already very concerned about how much power the wealthy have. I mean, if you look at polls, again and again, Americans say they're worried that the wealthy have too much power in society, that the voice of ordinary citizens doesn't count. And there's also a lot of concerns about the power of elites broadly, which I think helps explain what happened in the last election, right? And so into this environment of so much inequality are coming these big new donors. You mentioned public education as a great example of that. I mean, Americans think of public education as being one of the kind of key democratic institutions. The school in your neighborhood, the local PTA, the school board, and it's an area of democratic life that the public cares a lot about. And these new donors are exercising a lot of power by, coming in and bankrolling, charter schools and other kinds of efforts to change education. Whether you like charter schools or not, I think raises troubling questions about who's really driving the train in our democracy.
Well, listeners should realize that these foundations are created based on tax exemption. That is, people like Gates and the Walton family give money to 501c3 foundations, and they get a tax deduction. The foundations themselves are tax exempt. So in a way, the taxpayers are partners, not very influential partners, in what these foundations do and any abuses they engage in, any violations of payout ratios. There hasn't been a congressional hearing on the foundations of any substance for many years. I remember the House Ways and Means Committee had hearings many years ago. Tell us how you see the abuses that are coming on the horizon here as these foundations square off against one another, and they're really political in terms of their choices, and whether the IRS is policing the fine line between charitable and educational grants and engaging in politics and elections.
Well, the problem is not so much that there's abuses of the law and foundations or donors doing things that are illegal. The problem is that so much of their exercise of power is completely within the law. You know, the law grants wide latitude in terms of how philanthropic dollars can be used. And there's a lot of ways to use those tax-deductible gifts, as you say, to drive a political agenda. I mean, a great example is just look at the Mercer family. Robert Mercer, wealthy hedge fund guy, Rebecca Mercer, his daughter, have emerged as key donors to Donald Trump in the election. But previous to that, they also spent years building up a network of conservative think tanks. And one of them was this place called the Government Accountability Institute, which basically is an anti-Hillary Clinton operation. That the founder of it produced a book called Clinton Cash. The Government Accountability Institute led the attack on the Clinton Foundation. Mercer money has also gone to a group called Judicial Watch, which was the main nonprofit leading the charge on Hillary Clinton's emails and the use of her private email server, trying to get those emails released to the public, keeping that issue in the news for month after month during the campaign. All of that was bankrolled by philanthropic dollars. Or look at the attack on the Affordable Care Act that began shortly after that law was signed by President Obama. That attack was mainly through litigation in the form of lawsuits that ended up, two of which ended up in the Supreme Court. One of those lawsuits knocked out the mandate for, Medicaid expansion. Those lawsuits were all financed by tax-deductible charitable gifts through, libertarian and conservative legal institutions that object to big government. And, I could go on with many more examples of how these tax-deductible dollars are used to sway policy outcomes in politics.
Yeah. Let's go on. We've been talking with David Callahan, the author of the new book, The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. And in the table of contents, listeners, you get an idea how fascinating this book is. Chapter 1 says, The Coming of Big Philanthropy. Chapter 2, Who Are These People? Chapter 3, The Grand Masters. Chapter 4, The Super Citizens. Chapter 5, The Disruptors. Chapter 6, Leverage Points. Chapter 7, Advocates. Chapter 8, Networkers. Chapter 9, The Next Generation, Heirs to Influence. Chapter 10, The New Medicis. And Chapter 11, Agents of Wealth. And you have an epilogue called Balancing Act. This is a very balanced book. It has fascinating information in it. And let's go through these very briefly, not all of them, but when you say the disruptors, who are you talking about?
Well, many of these philanthropists are really looking to make systemic change, which is to say that, in the old model of charity, you give money to your alma mater, you give money to a children's hospital, you give money to the United Way. The new model
the opera, the library, yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that. Write a check. And the new model is for many of these donors who are pretty young, they're coming from business, they've often been very successful in their careers, developing new products and services in tech or on Wall Street. What a lot of these people want to do is make big changes in society. They want to overhaul how the public school system works. They want to fundamentally, change how we do medical research or how certain key systems in our society work in terms of for protecting the environment. They're looking for kind of high leverage points, and they want to disrupt existing systems. the tech philanthropists are often most interested in kind of big ideas. When Mark Zuckerberg famously gave that $100 million to help improve the Newark school system in New Jersey, that the hope that he had was that this would sort of fundamentally change how public education operates in the U.S., that it would be a model of doing things dramatically different. And, that's how many of these people think. That effort didn't, work out so well, but there's a lot of people, billionaire donors, who are scrambling after that kind of big leverage point or trying to create the models for the future.
I was reading your book. I remembered a quote by Warren Buffett in another book about 25 years ago. This is before he pledged to give up to $32 billion to the Gates Foundation. He said that there aren't many new ideas in philanthropy, and he held to that viewpoint for a long time. And, he couldn't be more right today. Just look at the areas where nonprofit groups are trying to improve the health of our drinking water, aviation, bus, railroad safety, auto safety, projects like monitoring biotechnology, nonprofit watchdog groups on nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, the whole robotics thing. There's no charitable money going into groups trying to reduce occupational disease and trauma. It's 58,000 work-related deaths a year in the United States, according to OSHA. There's very little going to pesticide and herbicide reduction efforts. And I can go on. And then you say, where are all these big philanthropists? I mean, some of them are obviously very corporate inclined, and they're not going to give, but there are a lot of more liberal philanthropists. And just think of the following. I just wrote a column, David Callahan, we've been talking to, basically saying that you can get single payer, full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital, much, much more efficient, better life outcomes for $1 billion by some philanthropist helping organize Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district. That's 435 districts. And I can almost guarantee that over a 36-month period, organizing 2,000 people as networked volunteers with 4 full-time people in each congressional district, representing rising majority support for full Medicare for all, including a lot of conservative support, you'll get that through Congress. And yet there's no imagination to do that. We have a $3.4 trillion healthcare industry, and $1 billion will turn that thing completely around. I just wrote a column, you can get it on nader.org, that elaborates this. I'm really amazed at the massive frontiers that are not even considered. George Soros is known to be anti-war. He stood up bravely against the pending invasion of that criminal war in Iraq by Bush and Cheney. And yet, he could, but hasn't, funded a secretariat to connect all those retired military, diplomatic, and national security officials who stood up against the Iraq war, but they had no coordination. Nobody could multiply their effort and get them on Capitol Hill and get them on the media. And he never came around to do that. So I ask you, David Callahan, tell us what isn't so much in your book about how you would dream for major philanthropists to really improve this country and the world in ways that they're not thinking.
Well, you raise a great point about key areas that get neglected, and organizing is certainly one of them. Many of these wealthy philanthropists, they are coming from, the upper strata of the elite. They are people who exist in pretty rarefied circles, that they don't naturally gravitate to grassroots activism and organizing as a way to get things done. Climate change is a great example, right? If you look at the giving that's been going to climate change over the last decade, it's really increased a lot. Michael Bloomberg is a great example of that. Bloomberg has given over $80 million to the Sierra Club to advance its Beyond Coal campaign. And some of that, for sure, is going to grassroots activism, but a lot of it is going to litigation and lawyers using the courts and underwriting research on public health to try to shut down coal-fired power plants. The hedge fund guy, Julian Robertson, has given tens of millions of dollars to the Environmental Defense Fund to bankroll a lot of work on climate change public policy. But none of these climate donors have invested in really building the kind of organizing infrastructure and grassroots power that might actually change public consciousness about climate change and put real pressure on political representatives to do something about it.
On that point, you're absolutely right. Congress is the key institution to get a lot of what some of these philanthropists want in terms of a better country and a better world. And they almost never focus on Congress except at elections. But it's in between elections. There isn't, for example, a major advocacy group in Washington focusing entirely on Congress, say, going up to Capitol Hill, scientists, lawyers, public relation types, organizers, connecting to the back grassroots, trying to bring Congress around on climate change and overwhelm the opposition of the fossil fuel industry. Not one. I proposed a 100-person group to Tom Steyer, George Soros, and Al Gore, and their staff got back to us and they said, that's not where the action is. It's back in the grassroots. So wait a minute. It takes two hands to clap.
Yeah. Well, Tom Steyer is a donor in this space who's definitely been thinking about the political power necessary to move this issue by, creating and bankrolling NextGen, which does a lot of that kind of work, but a lot more needs to happen. I mean, look, climate change, experts agree, is the existential threat facing civilization, and yet if you look at the top priorities of the American public, it never makes the top 10 in terms of major problems that people are worried about. And I think that philanthropists have not been creative enough or spent enough money. I mean, even though they've given a lot more money, they haven't given nearly as much as they need to give to move that issue.
They're just not strategic enough because they ought to ask themselves, we want this and that for the good of our country. Who do we have to go through to get it? Who are the decision makers? Well, very often it's Congress and the state legislatures. And that while they do often focus on supporting this and that in the election, it's between elections that they fail miserably. There are groups here in Washington doing great work on food and nutrition. They can hardly get any grants, like the Center for Science and the Public Interest that has revolutionized nutrition with small donations in this country. Or Lois Gibbs, who has a network of groups, many of them mothers of children who've come down with leukemia and other ailments connected to toxic hotspots, dumps around the country. And she has $1 million budget. She's one of the greatest organizers in America. She can't beg or beseech any of these foundations whose purported interest is the environment to give them grants. I think strategically they need to join a couple of roundtables so they can discuss why they don't have better ideas, more strategic interventions, the way Warren Buffett alluded to earlier.
Well, certain issues have just not even been on the radar at all for some of these new philanthropists. I'll give you a great example, which is very little money has flowed to examine the impacts of free trade or provide a more critical look at globalization. An issue that turned out to be quite explosive politically, as we learned in the recent election when Donald Trump weaponized that issue, that trade issue. But, for decades, it was clear that, globalization was having devastating impacts on, many American workers. And yet the amount of grant money that has flowed to examine this issue has been minimal. And I think that reflects the fact that many of these philanthropists are coming from business. They sort of have reflexively accepted globalization and free trade as being positive things. They've not been interested in taking a more critical look at those issues or really researching them.
Those are really good examples. And two more are corporate crime. I mean, you should read the Wall Street Journal. It's a corporate crime epidemic, Wells Fargo, VW, GM, on and on and on, to drug companies. And there's almost no money going in from enlightened foundations. These aren't, right-wing corporate indentured foundations. It's just a lack of imagination. Labor, for example, there's almost no money going into helping workers organize unions. Even over 50 million non-unionized workers have indicated through polls that they would like to have collective bargaining to get better wages and pensions and safer workplace standards. So these are, maybe this would be your next book, David Callahan. It's all the lost opportunities here.
Here's the thing, Ralph. I mean, it's true that we haven't had a lot of progressive money going to sway these economic issues, but there actually has been a tremendous amount of conservative money that has gone to try to sway economic policy, financial regulations.
Anti-labor, you're right.
For the past 40 years, we've seen a powerfully well-funded conservative think tank infrastructure in Washington with groups like the Heritage Foundation, the AEI, Cato, on and on.
AEI is the American Enterprise
Institute, which is raising more money than ever now. It has at least 8 billionaire donors. It is doing quite well, and it has, among other things, sort of helped lead the attack to water down the Dodd-Frank, Wall Street financial regulation. The pushback against the minimum wage, Fight for 15, has come from these conservative think tanks. Many of the conservative think tanks operate, there's a lot of them now at the state level, these smaller state level groups, which are these sort of mini heritage foundations.
Like the ALEC group, lobbying group on state level.
ALEC is a national group that writes model legislation for state legislators and operates around the country and pushing a conservative agenda. It's been heavily funded by a number of major conservative foundations for decades, and that money has had a big impact.
So, what you're saying is that the right-wing foundations have a real strategic sense. I just gave a lot of examples. They're going after labor unions. They're going after legislation at the state level that's been enacted for years, trying to get it repealed. They're trying to restrict access to the courts. They oppose a lot of the progress for justice in our country. But the liberal foundations don't seem to have that, jugular sense, that sense of strategy to counteract on the same playing field all these right-wing groups, from the Walton Family Foundation to the Koch brothers and others. But let's look at the light side here. There's a rising impact of the Buffett foundations and the Buffett children. In page 231 in your book, you devote about 10 pages to the Buffett children. You want to go through them one by one, because I think they're going to have a remarkable impact, and they're very serious people.
Right. Well, they already are having a remarkable impact. I mean, one thing you have to understand about how philanthropic dollars flow broadly in terms of left versus right and, who's having the most impact is that progressive funders have been quite successful and strategic in pushing certain issues like the environment and LGBT rights and diversity, and the conservative funders have tended to be more effective and more focused on some of these economic and fiscal issues.
Yes.
And they've had a lot of impact there. In terms of the Buffett kids, this is a great example. The biggest cause for the Buffett family has been reproductive rights, and the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation is the biggest funder in the world, private funder in the world of reproductive health and rights services. And that giving annually is as much as $500 million. The Buffett family is the largest direct supporter of abortion services, private supporter of abortion services in the United States. It's pretty much the sole funder, as far as I can see, of efforts to train doctors in abortion. And worldwide, that foundation plays a huge role in helping support access to reproductive health services for, the millions of poor women around the world who get pregnant even though they wish not to, often die in illegal abortions. So this is a really critical foundation that is supported by those Buffett billions, and I think most Americans don't know much about that, but that's just one of the Buffett foundations. The Novo Foundation, which is created by Peter Buffett with his wife Jennifer, has emerged as a very important funder of women's rights and feminist causes here in the United States.
And countering violence against women. That's one of their big
countering violence against women. Has often been involved in some other issues. And Howard Buffett, another of the Buffett kids, he's been mainly involved in combating hunger worldwide and has done a lot of interesting things, particularly in Africa, to try to address food shortages there and bolster agricultural systems. And each of the kids, each of those foundations have been getting over $100 million a year in new money from Warren Buffett as he disposes of that vast fortune. But he has a lot left, a lot more to go. He still has $73 billion left that he plans to give away. So that story is going to be ongoing.
I know a little bit about Howard Buffett's activities in Africa and elsewhere. He goes into the most dangerous areas, the most deprived, poor areas full of conflict, and tries to get the people there to help them to raise their own food and to get their own clean drinking water sources and electricity. Amazingly courageous man. He also is a farmer in Illinois and illustrates a real hands-on practice. And I hope he'll get interested in other things like efforts by people who are trying to, instead of cutting down fruit trees in the jungle, they want to preserve the trees, teach people how to climb them and get the fruit, like in the Amazon with palm trees, and provide important food for people who need it in the area. And he's all about that, and he's written books on that, which you cite in your own book.
Right. Yeah, and it's a reminder that this phenomenon of big philanthropy really is complicated. I mean, there's a lot of these big donors out there, like Howard Buffett, who you just want to cheer on. You know, they're doing great stuff. Or, you know, Michael Bloomberg shutting down all those coal-fired power plants.
And working on tobacco and auto safety. I mean, he wades into real controversial issues, unlike a lot of the large philanthropists. And Peter Buffett, by the way, is developing an extensive farm near the Hudson in order to advance organic food and provide year-round fresh food. It's sort of like an experimental farm. And so there's a lot going on. Now, here's one of my pet ideas. We're talking with David Callahan, the author of the book, The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in the New Gilded Age. Here's one of my ideas. How can we get more ideas to these philanthropists person to person, like having a new idea conference or having them come to a gathering where people on the stage propose new initiatives that are bold and that have a solid base of probability behind them that there'll be success because the people on the stage have had experience. How do you break open that sort of force field around these foundations where you can't get new ideas to them?
That's a great question. It's really not clear how you do break in that way. And I wish I knew the answer.
Well, let's start with a convention. How about that? Bring them to a conference and have the well-prepared proposals, and then they can go into workshops and go into a more deep explanation depending on their interest. Well, we're going to try to see if that can occur. Looking back on your book and all the reviews of it, what did you wish you had put in the book in retrospect? And what's your next book going to be, if there is going to be one on philanthropy, which is your great expertise?
Yeah, well, in retrospect, it would have been nice to take up exactly the question you just raised, is how do these people get ideas? How can you get them? What is the process of asking for money? I wish I'd had a section in the book about the askers. Of course, there's a whole lot of people chasing after this new money, and there's a lot of interesting dynamics there in terms of how they get in the door, how they manage to get the attention of these donors. And there's some, there again, there's some kind of disturbing power dynamics, that you have the givers have all the money and you have an entire kind of bunch of people in the nonprofit sector who are chasing after that money and, who will make all sorts of compromises to get it.
We could show them with reasonable assurance that a small amount of money could turn Congress around on climate change. It could get full Medicare for all, save tens of thousands of lives, and have better outcomes, and reduce enormous anxiety among millions of people wondering if they can pay to take care of their loved ones. We can show them how to stop future wars of aggression by runaway presidential power. George Soros could have done that with a secretariat, bringing together all those high-ranking generals, admirals, former NSA leaders, and even security assistants to the first George Herbert Walker Bush, like James Baker and Brent Scowcroft, all of which wrote and opposed the Iraq War before it happened, But there was no aggregation, there was no stamina, there's no organization to increase the numbers and get them on the mass media. And so this is really almost a desperate plea for some of these philanthropists who know how to make a lot of money but don't have a clue as to what to do with it. Those are the exact words that were given to me by a major multi-billionaire in America, and he included himself in that. Okay, if that's true, you know how to make a lot of money, but you don't have a clue as to what to do with it, let's get together with the citizen groups, the citizen leaders who have put their lives in the pursuit of justice year after year in some sort of interpersonal exchange, face-to-face, getting by the screeners and the sentinels that keep these philanthropists from getting great ideas and giving them major roles in the history of our country and its future. Can you write a book about that, David Callahan?
No, but I will say this, that, many of these people, they do read the press, they are scouring for ideas, they will read the New York Times op-ed pages or, even places like The Nation magazine in terms of looking for ideas. So I think that they're not completely, walled off. But keep in mind that a lot of these people they're less drawn to these sort of controversial political issues like war, and they're often more drawn to sort of solving specific problems around, education and medical research and stuff like this. So there's more of them with a progressive political outlook, but many of them are these kind of more pragmatic, centrist, kind of technocrat types. They're not interested in movement building, organizing political power on the ground. That's just not the way most of them think.
That's well put. So even if they read the New York Times and that gives them suggestions indirectly, they need to be better educated. They come out of often technical, narrow backgrounds of Silicon Valley, and suddenly they're multi-billionaires. Jeff Bezos' example, he doesn't give much money away, and he's now one of the two richest people in the world, along with Bill Gates Jr. But just to give you an example, I don't think there's been much improvement in terms of decentralized philanthropic giving since Andrew Carnegie told America and Canada that if you, the community around North America, provide the land, that he, Andrew Carnegie, will build a library. And he built about 2,500 libraries, which had an enormous impact for people and children, immigrants, going into these libraries and getting educated, getting excited, having their expectation levels raised. And in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, I don't think anything has been written better by a multi-billionaire than the steel magnate from Scotland, Andrew Carnegie, who said that a rich man who dies rich dies disgraced. And he gave away most of his money, the Carnegie University, the Carnegie Institution. And Warren Buffett, by the way, has done great work on supporting nuclear non-proliferation efforts led by former Senator Sam Nunn. And that's to keep nuclear materials, with the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, from going into dangerous hands, and keeping the non-proliferation arms treaty more observed. And that almost gets no attention. So there are really good controversial efforts by some of these philanthropists, but they can do so much more on immediate issues like full Medicare for all, climate change, cracking down on corporate crime, and building decentralized community bookstores, for example. Like instead of Carnegie libraries, they can give an incentive grant to build these decentralized community bookstores. Or we have a community lawyer in my hometown in Connecticut. There should be community lawyers and community technologists in towns around the country. So we need more strategy the way Andrew Carnegie displayed.
Well, it is worth pointing out that one of Andrew Carnegie's great issues was trying to eliminate war. And he was a real visionary in terms of trying to promote global peace movement. And it's interesting, you mentioned Warren Buffett as being one of the philanthropists who's given money for nuclear nonproliferation. Unfortunately, that giving has not continued. That was an issue that was dear to his wife, who passed away in 2004. But the Buffett family has not continued to give large amounts of money for those nuclear issues. And in fact, as far as I can see, there's no major philanthropist today who has made nuclear weapons and reducing the risk of nuclear war their top issue, even though experts agree that we are in one of the most dangerous stages of the nuclear age ever, in terms of the possibility of a nuclear detonation someplace in the world in the next 20 years. Many experts think that possibility is quite high, yet there's not much going on that issue in philanthropy, and certainly nobody bankrolling a strong peace movement in the United States to help to put those kinds of issues on the agenda.
Well said. Well said. And the Congress and the White House is not exactly prone toward those kinds of concentrations. Well, we've reached the end of our time, unfortunately. We'd like to say we're a radio program that allows our guests to speak in paragraphs, which you certainly have, David Callahan. And I hope we can continue this, and I hope that you're going to give us a peek about your next book before we close and tell people how they can contact you.
Well, I hope people read the book that I just wrote. You can find it wherever books are sold, as they say, and it's called The Givers. And also, InsidePhilanthropy.com provides kind of ongoing analysis of the new philanthropists, as well as the legacy foundations like Ford and Rockefeller and Carnegie. We really cover it all. It's a big world of philanthropy these days, and we try to keep our fingers on what donors from all over the political spectrum are doing across a big range of issues, from education to the environment to healthcare to global health.
Just a quick question occurred to me. Did any of these philanthropists react to the way you portrayed them in the book? Did they ever write you a letter or call you?
No, I did get one. The Wall Street Journal reviewed my book, and the review was by one of these billionaire philanthropists who was not in the book, but had a pretty negative take on my book. He thought that one of my arguments in the book, of course, is that government is the most important agent of change in a democracy in terms of a vehicle for citizens to get things done together and solve their problems. And, he thought I was sort of naive in imagining that we can revive government as a means to collectively solve our problems. And I think that these billionaire donors really don't like to be challenged.
That's true, and they're very biased against government bureaucracy and government in general from different angles, I might add. Well, they might want to read a new book called American Amnesia by Mr. Hacker, who reminds the American people of all the things they like in this country that were initiated through democratic governments, local, state, and national, over the last 2 centuries. Thank you very much, David Callahan. Read this book, listeners. It's called The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. It'll whet your appetite to ask some local philanthropists to give more here and there for a better community, a better region, a better nation, and a better world. Thank you very much, David Callahan. To be continued.
Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking to David Callahan, author of The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Tuesday, August 1, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. White House advisor Steve Bannon wants to regulate tech companies like Facebook and Google as utilities. That's according to a report by Ryan Grimm in The Intercept. Bannon's basic argument is that Facebook and Google have become effectively a necessity in contemporary life. Indeed, there may be something about an online social network or a search engine that lends itself to becoming a natural monopoly, much like a cable company or a water and sewer system or a railroad. Grimm says that it's not Bannon's only counterintuitive proposal to float. He also told people close to him that he wants to raise the top marginal tax rate to 44% for people who earn more than $5 million per year. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. And Ralph, I just want to get a clarification from you about our last conversation. So it sounds like you're not against political philanthropy. You just wish there were more progressive initiatives being given to.
That's correct. I mean, anything important in this country to change can be called political, like health care, cracking down on corporate crime. But the main thing is just to keep these foundations out of deep involvement in electoral campaigns, choosing which candidates they want to support or oppose. They can always do that through their political action committees under the law, but they shouldn't cross that line with 501c3 foundations.
All right. Well, very good. We've got some time for some listener questions. So, David, why don't you take our first question?
This is from David Baru. Dear Ralph, how do you feel about England's health service? It seems to me that it is superior even to single payer in that it mostly eliminates the fee-for-service system. Instead, the doctors are salaried employees of the system, and their compensation is independent of their choice of treatment. This eliminates the temptation to overprescribe treatments. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, the first thing is that the majority of people in England still love their health service. The main controversies in England are underinvestment in hospitals and other facilities, and they're always wrangling in Parliament between the different parties as to how much to increase the investment, because they spend less than half per capita of what we spend in our country, and they cover everybody. And of course, we have tens of millions of people in this country not insured or underinsured. The second point about the English health service, it is more of a socialized medical system in the sense that the doctors and hospitals work for the government's health service, and they don't have fee-for-service system, which often leads to overdiagnosis and overtreatment. But single-payer systems can exist without fee-for-service. In Canada, there are budgets allocated to hospitals, for example, and doctors, and you don't have as much overdiagnosis, overtreatment, overprescription of drugs. So all healthcare systems have problems, but when you have universal, comprehensive, accessible, and affordable healthcare for everybody, we should have the problems that Canada and Britain and France and Norway and Japan have compared to ours.
But as a general rule, Ralph, you would prefer the Canadian system over the English system.
I do, because it allows free choice of doctor and hospital anywhere in Canada, and it is an extremely efficient system that is more flexible than a totally public health system like Britain.
Well, thank you for that question. Our next question comes from Melody Holswade, and she says, "Hi, my name is Melody Holswade, and she lives outside of Austin, Texas, in a small town called Manor. And she says that recently a company called Ergon Asphalt Emissions moved into her area about a half mile from her subdivision, and the fumes that they released are unbearable. She says they've been told that everything is fine, they're in compliance, but the smell burns her, their throats, noses, eyes, every time they go outside. She has migraines on a regular basis. The health of newborns, nursing mothers, children, etc. at stake. She says, please help us deal with this terrible situation. Everyone in our area is very upset."
I don't know how far along they are in trying to shut this pollution down, but here are my quick suggestions. First of all, you should get newspapers to cover it, like the Austin, Texas Statesman, a newspaper. Contact local environmental groups who should be interested in this serious situation. The Environmental Working Group is one. Contact Jim Hightower. He has good connections of activists in Texas. He's in Austin, Texas. Jim Hightower. You can Google him. Public Citizen has an office in Austin, Texas, that can provide you with leads. You need lawyers immediately to file injunctions to put a stop to these silent forms of violence that are enveloping your subdivision, your families, and your children, given what you've said about what is coming out of this company's emission pipes. And go to the Regional Environmental Protection Agency office, even though it's being run into the ground by Scott Pruitt, who heads it, and he's heading for trouble himself in the way he's shutting down these life-saving programs. But put the burden on the regional director of EPA there. But it seems to me what you need right away is injunction action to take it to the courts, because this is a silent form of violence that's affecting your children. Imagine, David, Steve, living peacefully in a community, then a company comes and a half mile away, it's discharging these unbearable fumes.
No. Yeah, I imagine I got a helpless sense from her letter there that all of a sudden it's an invasion of some alien force.
And also Lois Gibbs, just look her up. She's in Virginia. She has a network all over the country of local groups, many of them mothers who are trying to protect their children the way you are.
Well, thank you for the question, Melanie. And I hope you take us up on those recommendations and let us know if you get any satisfaction. Thank you all for your questions. That's our show. Keep the questions coming on Ralph's Facebook page or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Facebook page. I want to thank, again, our guest, David Callahan, author of The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
If you're interested in visiting the American Museum of Tort Law this summer, please go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore, browsing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin.
Our executive producer is Alan Minsky, and our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak to Democratic Congressman from Maryland and environmental advocate Jamie Raskin. We'll talk to you then, Ralph.
Thank you. He's one of the great new young congressmen in the Congress. Jamie Raskin, constitutional law expert as well. And I'd love to send you my weekly column free, listeners. All you have to do is go to nader.org, sign up. You'll automatically get 7 minutes of agitation and what you can do to improve our country, your community, and the world.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We